All right, so today we're diving deep into this whole world of international student recruitment,
Okay.
and specifically Russia's strategy for attracting students from Africa. You've sent over some really compelling articles and analyses on this, and it seems like a fascinating and complex situation.
Yeah, it is really interesting to see how Russia is positioning itself in this global education landscape.
Yeah.
There's definitely a strategic element to their approach, especially considering the current geopolitical climate.
Right, and one of the things that jumps out immediately is Russia's pushing hard for these African students, even with the conflict in Ukraine and some of the issues that have been reported about racism in the past. Do you think those factors are deterring potential applicants?
Well, it's certainly a valid concern. The conflict in Ukraine in particular has undoubtedly raised anxieties and uncertainties. But we also need to consider the perspective of students who might see this as a time when other countries are pulling back. And this leaves a potential opportunity for them.
Yeah, it's like they're stepping into a space that others might be hesitant to fill. But what about the practicalities? Russia's offering some pretty enticing incentives, low tuition fees, a variety of programs in English and French, and even guaranteed admission to some universities. Are those the main driving forces behind this surge in applications?
I think those financial incentives are definitely a major draw, especially for students facing economic constraints. But it's important to remember that choosing where to study abroad is a multifaceted decision. Cost is one factor, but there are other crucial considerations that weigh heavily on a student's mind.
Okay, let's break those down. What are some of the other factors that African students might be taking into account when considering Russia?
Well, career prospects are a big one.
Hmm.
Students want to know if their Russian degree will be recognized internationally, and if it will lead to good job opportunities, whether in Russia or back home in Africa.
That makes sense. You're investing time, money, and energy into getting an education. You want to be sure it's going to pay off in the long run.
Exactly. And then there's also the question of the quality of education. Are Russian universities offering programs that are on par with institutions in other countries? How does the curriculum align with the needs of the African job market? These are questions that students and their families are carefully considering.
And you mentioned easier paths to citizenship as another potential incentive that Russia is offering. Is that a realistic prospect for African students, or is it more of a marketing tactic?
That's a very important question. The promise of easier citizenship can be a powerful draw, but it's essential to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the actual policies in place. What specific visa-free entry policies are being offered? What are the actual requirements for obtaining citizenship?
So you're talking about doing some serious due diligence, not just taking the promises at face value.
Absolutely. Students need to carefully research these claims and understand the nuances of the immigration system before making any decisions based on these promises.
Now, Russia's also playing up their historical ties to Africa, emphasizing their shared anti-colonial struggles. But how do these historical connections actually translate into tangible benefits for students on the ground today?
That's an excellent point. While the historical narrative might resonate with, some students need to look for concrete evidence of how those ties translate into practical advantages. Are there specific scholarships or programs exclusively for African students? Do these historical connections lead to better job opportunities or networking possibilities?
It's easy to get swept up in the narrative, but students need to focus on the facts on the ground.
Precisely. They need to ask, what does this historical connection actually mean for me as a student in terms of my education, my career, and my future?
You also mentioned that besides career prospects, quality of education, and potential pathways to citizenship, students might also be considering quality of life and safety. Especially with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, those are definitely things to consider.
Yes, safety and quality of life are paramount concerns. Students need to feel secure in their environment and confident that their well-being is protected. The conflict in Ukraine adds another layer of complexity. It raises questions about personal safety, travel restrictions, and even potential economic repercussions.
So it's not just about academics and career paths, but also about the overall experience of living and studying in Russia.
Exactly. Students are looking for an enriching and fulfilling experience where they can grow both personally and professionally.
It's interesting how you've highlighted both the appealing aspects and the potential challenges of studying in Russia. It's not a simple black and white situation.
Not at all. It's a complex tapestry of factors, and students need to weigh each element carefully before making a decision that aligns with their personal goals and aspirations.
You've mentioned that students want to know if their Russian degree will be recognized internationally. What are some of the specific concerns they might have about this?
One major concern is whether Russian degrees will be accepted by employers and universities in other countries. This is particularly important for students who plan to pursue further studies or seek employment outside of Russia after graduation. They need to research whether their chosen field of study is recognized and valued in their target countries.
So it's not just about the name of the university or the program, but about how that degree is perceived globally.
Precisely. Another concern is the accreditation of Russian universities. Not all universities are created equal, and students need to ensure that the institution they choose is reputable and meets international standards.
That's a good point. Accreditation can make a big difference in the perceived value of a degree.
Absolutely. And this ties back to the question of quality of education. Students need to look beyond the marketing materials and delve into the specifics of the curriculum, the faculty, and the resources available.
And what about the language barrier? We've talked about programs being offered in English and French, but is that enough to navigate everyday life in Russia?
That's another crucial factor. While studying in a language you're comfortable with is important, it's equally important to consider the language spoken outside the classroom. Will students be able to interact with locals, navigate public transportation, or access essential services if they don't speak Russian?
It seems like the decision to study in Russia involves a lot more than just comparing tuition fees. It's a multifaceted decision with long-term implications.
It is, and it's a decision that should be made with a clear understanding of both the potential benefits and the potential challenges.
Now let's talk a little bit more about the potential challenges. We've touched upon the Ukraine conflict and the question of safety. Are there any other specific concerns that African students might have about studying in Russia?
Well, one concern that has been raised in the past is the issue of racism and discrimination. Unfortunately, there have been documented instances of African students facing prejudice and hostility in Russia.
That's definitely something that students need to be aware of.
Absolutely. It's crucial to acknowledge this reality and for potential students to research these issues and consider the potential impact on their experience.
Yeah.
They should look for information on how Russian universities are addressing these concerns and what support systems are in place for international students.
It's about being informed and prepared, and not shying away from difficult conversations.
Exactly. And it's about choosing a university that aligns with your values and where you feel safe and supported.
We've been focusing on the student's perspective, but let's not forget about Russia's perspective. What do you think are their primary motivations for attracting so many African students?
That's a great question. On a practical level, Russia is facing a demographic decline and needs skilled workers to bolster its economy. Attracting talented students from Africa could help address this issue.
So it's about filling a gap in the workforce.
Yes, but there's also a geopolitical element at play. By strengthening ties with African nations through education, Russia is seeking to increase its influence and soft power on the continent.
It's like education is becoming a tool of diplomacy and a way to build alliances.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting. Russia's push for African students is happening against a backdrop of other nations shifting their international student priorities. The UK, Malaysia, and Ireland are looking to Africa, while France is moving away. And the U.S., well, recent changes might mean fewer African students heading there.
And that creates an opportunity for, you guessed it, Russia.
Exactly. Russia is strategically positioning itself to fill the void, potentially becoming a major hub for African students seeking international education.
That's a pretty significant shift in the landscape of global education.
It is, and the implications of this shift are far-reaching, potentially reshaping not just the education sector, but also international relations and global power dynamics.
Wow, it really puts things into perspective. It's not just about individual students choosing where to study. It's about a larger power shift happening on the global stage.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the complexities of this situation is so important. It helps us make sense of the motivations, the strategies, and the potential consequences of these decisions.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the allure of low tuition fees, the importance of career prospects and quality of education, the complexities of citizenship pathways, and the historical ties between Russia and Africa. We've also discussed the potential challenges, including the Ukraine conflict, the language barrier, and the issue of racism and discrimination. But there's another piece of this puzzle that I want to explore: the role of soft power and how it plays into Russia's strategy. Let's dive into that in part 2 of our deep dive.
You're absolutely right to highlight the role of soft power. It's a subtle but powerful tool that countries use to influence global perceptions and build relationships. And in the context of international student recruitment, it's particularly effective.
I'm curious to understand how Russia is wielding this soft power in its pursuit of African students. What are some of the specific tactics they're using?
Well, one key tactic is shaping the narrative. They're emphasizing their historical ties to Africa, highlighting their shared anti-colonial struggles, and portraying themselves as a more authentic partner compared to the West. They're even drawing parallels between their current conflict with Ukraine and Africa's own fight for liberation, framing themselves as standing up against Western imperialism.
That's a pretty compelling narrative, especially for audiences who may view Western involvement in Africa with a critical eye. It's like they're positioning themselves as a natural ally, a kindred spirit.
Exactly, and they're reinforcing this narrative through various channels. Cultural exchanges, scholarships targeted at specific regions, collaborations with African universities, and even media campaigns that showcase the positive experiences of African students in Russia.
It's a multi-pronged approach that goes beyond simply offering lower tuition fees. They're investing in building long-term relationships and fostering a sense of goodwill.
And it's not just about attracting students, it's about cultivating future leaders, policymakers, and influencers who will have a positive view of Russia and its role in the world.
So it's a strategic investment with potentially long-term returns. But how effective do you think the soft power strategy actually is? Are African students buying into this narrative?
That's a complex question. While the narrative might resonate with some, it's essential to remember that students are discerning individuals with their own aspirations and priorities. They're not simply pawns in a geopolitical game.
Right. They're making decisions based on a whole range of factors, as we discussed earlier: career prospects, quality of education, personal safety, cultural fit. The narrative is just one piece of the puzzle.
Precisely. And while Russia might be offering a compelling narrative, it's competing with other countries that are also vying for African students.
Mm.
The UK, for example, has a long history of educational exchange with Africa and offers a well-established higher education system. China is also emerging as a major player, with its Belt and Road Initiative creating new opportunities for African students.
So it's a competitive landscape, and even if Russia's narrative resonates, they still need to deliver on the practical aspects of education and student experience.
Absolutely. Students are looking for concrete evidence of quality, not just promises. They want to know that their Russian degree will be valued, that they'll have access to good job opportunities, and that they'll be treated fairly and respectfully.
And that brings us back to some of the potential challenges we discussed earlier: the concerns about racism, the uncertainty surrounding the Ukraine conflict, and the questions about the transferability of Russian degrees.
Yes, these are real concerns that cannot be ignored, and they highlight the importance of critical thinking. And independent research students need to look beyond the glossy brochures and delve into the realities of studying and living in Russia.
They need to talk to other students, consult independent sources of information, and weigh the potential risks against the potential rewards.
Exactly. It's about making an informed decision, not just being swayed by a compelling narrative or the allure of low tuition fees.
Now, you've mentioned that some are viewing Russia's recruitment drive as a way to fill a gap in their workforce due to demographic decline. Could this also be interpreted as a form of brain drain, potentially depriving African countries of their brightest minds?
That's a valid concern. It's a debate that's been ongoing for decades. On one hand, studying abroad can provide students with valuable skills and experiences that they can bring back to their home countries. On the other hand, if those students choose to remain abroad after graduation, their home countries lose out on their talent and expertise.
So it's a double-edged sword, and it raises the question of what responsibility, if any, countries like Russia have in ensuring that the benefits of this educational exchange are shared more equitably.
That's a crucial question, and it's one that policymakers and educators need to grapple with. Are there ways to encourage students to return to their home countries after graduation? Can we create programs that foster knowledge transfer and collaboration?
It's about creating a system that benefits both the students and their home countries.
Exactly. It's about fostering a win-win situation where education becomes a tool for development and progress, not just a means of individual advancement.
We've talked about Russia's perspective and the potential benefits and drawbacks for African students, but what about the global implications of this shift in international student recruitment? How do you see this playing out in the larger geopolitical landscape?
That's where things get really fascinating as Russia strengthens its ties with Africa through education. It's also challenging the traditional dominance of Western institutions in the global education market.
It's like a redistribution of power and influence.
Precisely. And it has the potential to reshape the way we think about education development and international relations.
For example, if Russia becomes a major hub for African students, will that shift the focus of academic research and innovation? Will it create new centers of intellectual and cultural exchange?
Those are excellent questions, and the answers are still unfolding, but one thing is clear.
Hmm.
The landscape of global education is becoming more diverse and multipolar.
It's no longer a one-way street with students from developing countries flowing exclusively to Western institutions. There are now more options, more pathways, and more voices shaping the future of education.
And that's ultimately a good thing. It creates more opportunities for students, fosters greater cross-cultural understanding, and challenges the traditional hierarchies of knowledge and power.
It's like the world of education is becoming more interconnected, more dynamic, and more reflective of the globalized reality we live in.
Absolutely. And that's why this deep dive into Russia's push for African students is so relevant. It's a microcosm of the larger shifts happening in the world today. The changing balance of power, the rise of new players, and the increasing importance of soft power in shaping global perceptions.
This has been a really insightful discussion, and you've given us a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier, the importance of students being discerning and doing their own research.
What?
What are some specific tips you'd give to African students who are considering studying in Russia?
Great question, first and foremost. I'd encourage them to look beyond the marketing materials and engage in thorough research. Talk to students who have already studied in Russia, both those who had positive experiences and those who face challenges. Consult independent sources of information such as educational rankings, academic journals, and reputable news outlets.
So it's about getting a balanced perspective, not just relying on the information provided by the universities or recruitment agencies.
Exactly. Another important tip is to carefully research the specific program and university they're interested in. Look into the curriculum, the faculty, the resources available, and the accreditation of the institution. Don't just choose a program based on its name or reputation. Delve into the details and make sure it aligns with your academic goals and career aspirations.
So it's about finding the right fit, not just going for the most well-known or prestigious option.
Precisely. And finally, I'd encourage students to think about their long-term goals. Where do they see themselves living and working after graduation? What skills and experiences will they need to succeed in their chosen field?
It's about aligning their educational choices with their personal and professional aspirations.
Exactly. Studying abroad is a significant investment, and it's crucial to make a decision that will set you on the path to a fulfilling and successful future.
I think that's great advice for any student, regardless of where they choose to study. It's about being proactive, informed, and intentional about your educational journey.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great place to pause for now. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some broader questions about the future of global education and what this shift in power dynamics means for students, universities, and the world at large.
You know, it's fascinating to see how education is becoming like a key battleground in this global power struggle. It's not just about academics anymore. It's about influence, soft power, shaping the future.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense when you think about it. Education shapes minds, shapes perspectives,
Yeah.
and ultimately it shapes the future.
Right.
Countries like Russia understand that investing in education, especially attracting those bright minds from other nations, it's a strategic move with long-term implications.
Right. And it's not just Russia. We see other countries doing this too. China's Confucius Institutes, the U.S. Fulbright program, the UK's Chevening scholarships. It seems like every nation with these global ambitions is using education as a tool to project their influence.
Absolutely. It's a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's something that students need to be aware of. When you accept a scholarship or enroll in a university, you're not just getting an education. You're also stepping into a larger system of power and influence.
So it's not just about choosing a course or a university. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the political and economic forces that are shaping the educational landscape.
Exactly. And it's about being a critical consumer of education. Don't just accept the narrative that's being presented to you. Question it, research it, and make sure that it aligns with your own values and goals.
That brings up a really interesting point about values. One thing that struck me in these articles was the tension between this idealistic vision of education as a force for good and then the more pragmatic reality of education as like a tool for national interest.
That's a tension that's always existed. But it's becoming even more pronounced in today's world. We see countries promoting educational programs that align with their own strategic goals, whether it's economic development, technological advancement, or geopolitical influence.
So how do we reconcile these two perspectives, the ideal and the real?
I think it starts with acknowledging that education is never neutral. It always carries with it a set of values. a worldview, a particular perspective. And it's up to students to be aware of those underlying values and to choose educational paths that align with their own beliefs and aspirations.
That's a powerful message, to be conscious and deliberate about your educational choices.
And to remember that education is not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about developing the skills and the mindset to navigate this complex and ever-changing world. It's about critical thinking, problem solving, and adaptability.
So what does all of this mean for you, our listener? What should you take away from this deep dive into Russia's push for African students and the broader trends in global education?
I think the key takeaway is this. The world of education is in flux. The old rules are changing, new players are emerging, and the opportunities for students are expanding, but so are the complexities.
It's a more dynamic and competitive landscape, but also a more uncertain one.
Exactly. So my advice to students is this. Do your research, be critical, ask tough questions, and don't be afraid to challenge assumptions.
Think about your long-term goals, your values, and the kind of world you want to live in, and then choose an educational path that will equip you to not just survive, but to thrive in that world.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a perfect note to end our deep dive on.
It's been an incredibly enlightening conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the world of international education and the forces that are shaping its future.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring the possibilities. The world is full of fascinating discoveries waiting to be made.
And who knows, maybe your educational journey will lead you to become a part of this evolving story of global education. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.